Xerxes tried to tell himself not to be afraid. It was an easy thing to say, but a much harder thing to do. The landing craft pitched beneath his chitinous feet as it screamed towards planetfall through a sky thick with flak and anti-voidcraft fire. His deck shook violently as it feared to avoid being incinerated, and more than a few of the troopers around him lost their footing, stumbled and fell. Xerxes did not have teeth, but if he did, he would have gritted them with the effort it took to keep his fear glands under control. His twin antenna palps twitched. He looked down at his weapon and checked his readiness for what must have been the millionth time. It was not a weapon made by his people. No labourer or hive metallurgist of his people had brought it forth from the foundries of their homeworld. The weapon had been made by humans, for humans, on a planet populated by humans many hundreds of light years away from the battle raging outside. The landing craft had no windows. It had been deliberately designed that way, for it would hardly help a soldier's morale if he were able to look outside and see other troop ships being blasted out of the sky. But even without windows, Xerxes knew. The noise alone was so loud that those with external auditory organs tried to cover them. He was grateful he did not have any. The small pinprick holes on either side of his cranium could be easily covered with a specialized membrane beneath his carapace. He felt his heart begin to race as the dropship continued its rapid descent, tightening its hold on the rail overhead to keep from tripping. Xerxes was no warrior. None of his people were, not by nature, not like other species, not like the humans. The insectoid Kalekians, the race to which he belonged, were builders, not fighters. They had made their world of Andrax into one great globe-spanning hive, carving vast networks of tunnels and building massive mound-like nest cities both above and beneath the ground. For the wealth of Andrax lay in its soil, in vast deposits of ores and metal so rich that the output of just one mine could equal that of an entire star system. With such a bounty beneath their feet, what else could the Kalekians have become but a race of metalsmiths, craftsmen and architects? Indeed, it came so naturally to them that most Kalekians had never contemplated being anything else. Even their religion, music and poetry revolved around the shaping of stone and metal. Their music employed the same hammers and other tools they used in their cavernous forges, and their gods were the builders, immortal architects who placed every star in the sky and forged every planet upon their celestial anvil. The Kalekians believed that every blast of steam from the great smithies was the builder's breath, and every forge and workshop was a church to their glory. And so the Kalekians had prospered for millennia. Their hives grew larger, their forges grander. They sold the things they made to surrounding systems, and brought great wealth to their people from trade. Kalekian goods became known across multiple sectors for their beauty and quality, and as their technological prowess grew, so too did the variety of things they made. Starship parts, electronics, consumer goods, it didn't matter to Xerxes folk. They were happy to accept contracts from just about anyone, as long as the terms were fair, and they could hone their craft in peace. And for thousands of years, they had done just that. But this golden age has also sown the seeds of their downfall. Xerxes knew that now. All his people did, though they hadn't known it at the time. The only thing the Kalekians had refused to make were weapons. They were creators, not destroyers, and the idea of using their great tools to churn out tools of death and destruction appalled them. There were other places that made weapons in great quantities, other forge worlds. Those who needed or wanted weapons could go there, but not to Andrax. No weapon ever came from its foundries or smelters, not for off-worlders, and not for the Kalekians themselves. And why would they? What need did the chosen of the builders have for weapons? If they were attacked, they could simply go underground and seal themselves away. For in those vast underground caves, they had everything they needed to be self-sufficient. But why would anyone want to attack them? The Kalekians were not warriors. They did not make enemies the way other races did. They dealt fairly with everyone who approached them. There was no reason for them to fight anyone, nor for anyone to fight with them. It made Xerxes shudder now, to think that his people had ever been so naive. That naivety had died the day Praxian ships had entered Andrax's upper atmosphere and subjected their innocent planet to a storm of orbital weapons fire. Their world had cried out and shuddered in pain, and some of the great caverns had collapsed, killing millions of Kalekians in an instant. The great mound cities on the surface had burned to ash, along with their race's innocence, and when the invading armies had landed, the Kalekians had nothing to defend themselves with. The Praxians wanted the Kalekian skill and the resources of Andrax for their empire, and they had seized both with ruthless efficiency. They subjugated the Kalekians and turned them from a proud race of craftsmen and forge workers to just one more race of slaves, bound in chains and forced to work beneath the whips and cruel lives of their new overlords. The great forges were corrupted into factories that produced millions of weapons for the Praxians' war machine. The hive cities were turned into slave pens. Even the images of the builders were torn down and replaced with idols of cruel Praxian war gods. All the Kalekians had achieved was reduced to ruin, or worse, turned to evil purpose. The Kalekians' lives were made bitter by their conquerors, and for generations, Xerxes' ancestors had lived and died in chains. And then the humans had come. They had come as a thunderstorm comes, with little warning, little notice, and overwhelming fury. Xerxes had been topside on an errand for one of the overseers when he had seen the flames of war in the sky. He had looked on in awe as, one by one, the Praxian ships that held his world and Frayo were destroyed. The noise was incredible, and more slaves had stopped what they were doing, turning their gaze heavenward, even as their masters' electro-whips fell across their backs. The Praxians were being annihilated. How and why Xerxes had not known, but whatever came next could not possibly be worse than what the Kalekians had already endured. He and the other slaves had swarmed the overseer, and within a day riots and revolts had erupted across Andrax. The Kalekians had rallied to the aid of their liberators and taken terrible, bloody revenge. Not a single Praxian was left on Andrax alive. And then the humans had sent messengers to them, bearing words of liberation and news of the wider galaxy. Beyond Andrax, the void was aflame, they had said. They too had suffered at the hands of the Praxians, and now they were bringing a war of righteous vengeance to the empire of the oppressors. They had not asked for Kalekian aid at the time, but they did not have to. The humans had set them free, given them hope for the first time in living memory. Nothing, not even all the vast resources of Andrax, would ever be enough to repay that debt. To the last hatchling, every surviving member of the Kalekian race had sworn undying loyalty to the humans and their Terran confederacy. Kalekian youths like Xerxes volunteered in droves to serve in human armies, and the great forges were put to work once more. But now the Kalekians had no problem making weapons. The Praxians had taught them well. Now, as he hurtled towards the surface of Praxis 3, Xerxes clutched his own weapon tight and tried to muster his courage as best he could. Whatever the humans asked, he would do. His oath, and what the humans had done for his world, demanded no less. For dozens of other species conquered by the Praxians, the same was true. The humans had cast off the shackles of each world they took from the enemy's grip, and more than a dozen races now fought in its armies and fleets. "Planet 4 in 30 seconds, the pilot yelled over the din. "Get ready, you lot." "Builders," Xerxes thought, closing his multifaceted eyes. "Please watch over me." The ship rocked even more violently than before, and the pilot cried out in alarm and veered to avoid a direct hit. "Almost there," roared the Terran officer, who had been placed in command of Xerxes' unit. "Gonzalez," Xerxes thought. "His name is Gonzalez." "Remember our orders," Gonzalez continued. "The orbital shield generator in this sector has to be taken out to clear the way for fire support from the fleet." He pointed in the distance, drawing their eyes to a massive bunker complex beneath the Praxian lines. "That's it there. We push through these bastards, we kill them, and then we take it out. Our bombers can't do it. Whatever that building is made of, it's proof against most of our heavy ordnance, so it's up to us. We're going to break the door down and clear it out the old-fashioned way, then destroy it from within." His face set in the grim line. "If we succeed, our ships will be able to provide us with orbital fire support and make our jobs a whole lot easier, but if we fail, it'll be a much longer slog to the Praxian capital, and hundreds of thousands of good soldiers will die before we get there. Is that clear?" "Sir, yes, sir," the troopers replied. "I said, is that clear?" Gonzalez roared. They snapped to attention, including Xerxes. "Sir, yes, sir." The transport ship lurched to a screeching halt. The grinding whir of its landing gears being deployed was drowned out by the noise of war raging outside. Gonzalez shoved his way to the front, flicking the safety off his pulse rifle, as the ship's door slid open. The surface of Praxis 3 was a firestorm of battle. Laser fire of every colour stitched the air in all directions, while overhead hundreds of starfighters duelled in vicious dogfights. Every few seconds, a burning craft belonging to one side or the other would plummet to its doom in a column of smoke and flames, while the ground was already littered with the dead and the burning wrecks of hover tanks, mobile artillery pieces and heavy guns. There was no cover on the dry and arid surface, no place to hide. The only way for Xerxes and his comrades was forward, and in that direction, several hundred yards distant, lay the Praxian lines. The hell being unleashed by the enemy was terrifying in its ferocity, and despite being under heavy strafing and bombing from the Terrans, the rate of fire didn't seem to be slackening at all. Even as Xerxes watched, a heavy gunship bearing the eagle symbol of the Confederacy laid waste to a section of Praxian fortifications with a payload of cluster bombs. A solid line of scorching flames blossomed in the ship's wake. Hundreds of Praxians were reduced to cinders in an instant, and those unlucky enough not to be killed instantly ran in all directions, shrieking in a blaze before they finally collapsed. The sheer diversity of the Terran troops startling too. There were 4-armed hulking Gregorians fighting and dying on this battlefield, many of which carried heavy assault cannons and multi-barreled autoguns in each massive hand. Reptilian Scathori, resplendent in their brightly coloured battle dress, chanted hymns of slaughter as they poured from their troopships and into the fray. Xerxes knew the Scathori well, for they had been friends of his people before the Praxians came. A devoutly spiritual race, they were led into battle by their warrior priests, who had eschewed Terran weapons in favour of battle staves crafted in the jungles of their homeworld. These long rods served as badges of office in peacetime, but in times of war they could be fitted with a miniaturized disintegration weapon that unleashed white-hot beams of energy. Lupine Canorians, those great wolf-like bipeds, howled over the din, almost falling over themselves in their eagerness to close with the enemy. Blue-feathered Solari, six-legged Jorians, and, Xerxes' heart soared, other Kalikians like himself. Sergeant Gonzalez turned to face them. There was no time for a grand speech, nor was one necessary. Instead, he opened his mouth and roared out the battle cry that had heralded doom for dozens of Praxian worlds, and liberation to those they have subjugated. "For Terra!" he roared. "For Terra!" Xerxes cried, adding his voice to the roaring refrain. He had never been to Terra, would likely never see it, but he would fight for it, for Terra and Andrax stood as brothers now. They poured from the landing craft, roaring and cheering, and all around the maelstrom of death continued unabated. The Terrans charged over the open ground, heedless of how many of their dead they left behind, and the Praxians, spoiled for choice of targets, began to take a horrific toll. Xerxes saw an entire brigade of Scathori get blown to pieces by a heavy shell, saw the explosion of blood and viscera, and severed limbs that flew in all directions. His every instinct screamed at him to run, but he could not. He would not. He had to keep going. He had to honour his oath. They were running now, running full tilt at the enemy through the blistering, deadly hell that sought to sight them down. Many died before they knew what hit them. Others fell, maimed and torn, and screamed their last on the dusty, blood-stained earth. They were getting closer. The enemy lines were nearer now. Keep going. We have to keep going. A Gregorian 2 steps ahead of Xerxes was hit with a las round. His head disintegrated, and Xerxes couldn't help shrieking as he felt himself get sprayed with blood and bits of brain and bone. He spared a brief prayer to the builders for the dead one's spirit, but they could not stop to mourn him. If they stopped, they would all die. Even Xerxes, new to the ways of war, saw that clearly. Closer now. Closer. Hover tanks began to open fire as they came within range and began pounding the Praxian positions. The roar of their turret guns left a ringing in Xerxes' auditory organs, but the sound was as sweet to him as music. Even sweeter was the sight of Praxian bunkers and pillboxes being blasted to smithereens. Closer. Ever closer. Gonzalez opened up with his pulse rifle, and his entire unit followed suit. Xerxes was not a natural fighter, but the Terrans had trained him well, and his movements were smooth and practiced. He brought his weapon up to his left eye, aimed, and fired. 100 yards away, a Praxian died. Xerxes didn't stop to think about that. He chose another target, aimed, fired, then chose another. And all the while he kept pace with Gonzalez and the others, pounding the earth with his insectoid feet as they closed with the enemy. He could see the Praxians begin to panic, saw the fear on their faces when they realized they were going to be overrun. The sight was very pleasing to him. Now the Praxians knew how his people felt when Andrax fell. Now they knew what it was like to be invaded and besieged and afraid. As the humans were fond of saying, payback was a bitch. Several Praxians tried to flee as the Terrans closed the distance, only to be shot in the back by those of higher rank. A second later, the Terrans smashed into their lines. And then all hell really broke loose. Gonzalez leapt into one of the trenches, firing at everything that moved and cutting down a dozen Praxian soldiers before they could even bring their own weapons to bear. The Scathori leapt through the air at their hated enemies with savage frenzy, some of them even casting their arms aside and ripping the Praxians apart with their razor-sharp claws and teeth. Even his fellow Kalikians were caught up in the frenzy of close combat. They poured over the Praxians like a horde of crazed army ants, stabbing and shooting, and using their rifles as clubs when their ammunition finally ran out. Xerxes saw a Praxian soldier, gave a chittering screech, and ran at him. His bayonet plunged into the other alien's chest like a hot knife or a slab of butter. The Praxian stared, looked up at Xerxes, and gave a dying gurgle. "For my people," Xerxes whispered. He tore his weapon free, in time to see another Praxian charging at him. This one must have been an officer, for his uniform was more elaborate than the one Xerxes had just killed. and he wielded a sword whose edges glowed with intense heat. Xarius shot him in the chest. The officer fell, dead before he hit the ground, and Xarius wrenched the weapon from his twitching hands. He put it to good use a second later by cleaving another Praxian in two. "Keep moving," Gonzalez roared. "Follow me, come on. Do you want to live forever? Forward! Drive them back!" The Terrans pushed and kept pushing, and the trenches became a tightly packed slaughterhouse. Praxian and Terran alike fought with everything that came to hand: rifles, pistols, blades, and bare appendages. Xarius saw a woman get torn apart by lasfire at point-blank range, and even Gonzalez himself narrowly avoided death by seizing a wounded enemy soldier and using him as a shield. Where the woman's killer had emptied his ammunition clip, he tossed the corpse to one side and shot the Praxian as he frantically tried to reload. Blood washed the trenches in rivers as the Terrans carved a path to their objective, but the Praxians were stubborn. They knew what was at stake, and each step towards the blockhouse that housed the shield generator was paid for in blood. Xarius fought with all his might, spurred on and encouraged by the bravery of his comrades. All around him, people were blasting and shooting, screaming and stabbing, falling and dying. The ground became so thick with corpses that he had to step high in order to walk over them. Xarius was careful to avoid the honoured dead of his own side, but the Praxians he trod upon without a second thought. One of those Praxians was still alive, though from the gaping hole in his belly, he probably wished otherwise. Xarius ended his misery by stabbing him in the throat. The shield generator was almost within reach now, 50 yards, maybe 75 at most. Without warning, a withering fire erupted from within the complex. Whether it came from automated defense systems or from living soldiers, Xarius didn't know, but it ripped through the advancing Terrans without mercy. Dozens of humans and their alien allies fell in an instant, cut down like wheat before the Reaper's scythe. In the packed confines of the trenchwork, the carnage was beyond all hope of description. Xarius himself fully managed to avoid being shredded by throwing himself to one side at the very last instant and taking cover behind a mound of corpses. Many of his comrades were not so lucky. Those who were hastily took up defensive positions and scrambled for what little cover they could find. "Someone take those guns out!" Gonzalez roared. "We have to get closer." "I'll do it!" Xarius was as surprised as anyone else to hear himself speak. The Terran tongue did not come naturally to his people. Their mouths were not made for it, but the translating device he wore at his throat translated the clicks and hisses of his native language as he spoke. "I'll go, Sergeant." "Don't be an idiot. You can't go out there alone. You won't get 10 yards before you're—" "But I won't be going toward it," Xarius said hastily, fighting not to let his fear and anxiety show. "I'll be going under it." He lifted his head a little, speaking with pride. "My people were burrowing deep into the mantle of blessed Andrax for thousands of years before the Praxians came. The builders, our gods, bless us with bodies well suited to digging, even without machines to aid us. Let me and some others of my kind go, my lord. The shield generator may have a hard shell, but its belly may be soft." "Why didn't you think of this before?" Gonzalez demanded. "Why didn't any of you think of this before? You could have made that suggestion to me. I could have taken up the chain of command." "We are not warriors," Xarius said defensively. "Not like you. We are new to the wiles and strategy of war. Please, Lord, do not bear this against my people. I only wish to help." Gonzalez nodded once. "It's a hell of a lot better than any of my ideas. Do it then." Xarius nodded. "Thank you, Lord." The human snorted. "I'm no lord, but if you pull this off, you might as well be one. Good luck, kid." "And," Xarius swallowed, "if I fail, will I bring disgrace?" Gonzalez put a hand on his thin shoulder. "No," he said. "If you fail, you would have done your duty to the best of your ability, and you will have shown initiative and courage. If you die, your honor will be intact." He slammed a fresh power clip into his rifle. "We'll distract them and draw their fire to buy you some time. Now go!" Xarius let out a shuddering breath. "Thank you, Lord." He then turned to the nearest group of Kollekians huddled nearby. "Brothers, sisters, come over here and listen to me. I have an idea."